In the Cold War, the enemy was everywhere. Across borders, in the sky, under the sea. But what if they were inside your head? This is the story of a war waged not with missiles but with minds. Of psychic spies, remote viewers, secret labs where men tried to bend spoons and perception on government payrolls. Of paranoia so deep it reached beyond the veil of the visible. Today we open the files. We follow the strange path that led both the CIA and Soviet intelligence into the world of the paranormal. ESP, telepathy, clairvoyance, remote viewing. Ideas mocked in public but funded in secret. In the early 1970s, US intelligence believed the Soviets were investing millions into mind control, telekinetic weapons and psychotronic warfare. And they feared falling behind in a race they barely understood. That fear sparked a psychic arms race. Classified project buried deep in the heart of America's military intelligence network, Project Stargate. And a parallel story from the other side of the Iron Curtain, where psychics were studied under the glare of Soviet scientists, and stories emerged of women who could move objects with their minds, stop a frog's heart, or see what lay thousands of miles away. Both sides denied, both sides suspected, and both sides spent millions, over decades. But did they find anything? That's the question. Some say they glimpsed true anomalies, accurate sketches of hidden bunkers, fugitives whose locations no one should have known. Others say it was smoke and mirrors, lucky guesses, data massaged into mystery. Yet the files don't lie. The money was real, the experiments were real, the fear was real. You're listening to Noir Frequency, and tonight we're investigating the CIA's experiments in extrasensory perception. Because in the heart of the Cold War, the battlefield wasn't just land or sea or sky, it was the mind. And both sides believed the other had found a way inside. Long before the CIA began sketching targets through psychic eyes, Soviet scientists were already watching the same invisible horizon. In the 1920s, not long after the Russian Revolution, researchers in Leningrad and Moscow were quietly experimenting in telepathy and hypnosis. The early Soviet state had a complicated relationship with mysticism. On the one hand, it was dismissed as unscientific bourgeois nonsense. On the other hand, if psychic phenomena could be real and controllable, then it could be weaponized. By the 1960s, whispers began reaching the West. Whispers of Soviet military parapsychology, of controlled telepathic experiments, of a growing belief, at least in some sectors of the Soviet defense establishment, that ESP could be real and strategic. They called it psychotronics. The term wrapped the supernatural in the language of science. Soviet researchers began describing telepathy not as a mystical force, but as a biological energy transmission, a quantum field of thought. Projects were conducted under the radar in institutes with names that gave away nothing. Institute of Brain Research, Department of Bioenergy Studies. And then came the names that would haunt intelligence reports for years. Nina Kulagina, a housewife from Leningrad, became the centerpiece of Soviet psychokinetic research. US intelligence reported that Kulagina had once been filmed slowing and stopping a frog's heart through sheer willpower. If true, one report noted such a capability might be imposed against human subjects. Was this real? The KGB refused to say. Soviet scientific publications began cautiously printing studies on bioenergetic influence. Meanwhile, parapsychologists claimed they were studying telepathic contact between submarines and command posts, with some insisting it worked better the farther apart the subjects were. Even cosmonauts were said to be involved in telepathic experiments while orbiting Earth. The West couldn't tell what was real and what was noise. Some analysts feared reports like these were genuine. Others suspected disinformation, deliberate exaggeration to trick the CIA into wasting time and money. But that ambiguity was the point. If your enemy might have psychic soldiers, can you afford not to look into it? Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union never fully embraced ESP, but it never rejected it either. It existed in a grey space, officially unsupported yet quietly studied. By the 1970s, CIA documents estimate 30 or more Soviet research centres were exploring psychic phenomena, often with military funding. One program, known in declassified files as Project Fernflower, reportedly operated within the Soviet military and GRU. Its goals? Unknown. Its methods? Classified. Its existence? Deniable. But as the US watched Kulagina bend matches and make inanimate objects twitch under her gaze, one question hung in the air. If she could do that to a frog, what could she do to a man? And if the Soviets were truly ahead in psychic research, how far behind was America? In 1972, under the growing weight of reports about Soviet psychic advances, the CIA approached the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, in Menlo Park, California. Their question was simple. Could psychic perception be real? And if it was, could it be used? The early work at SRI was led by two laser physicists turned parapsychology pioneers, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. They wanted to find testable, repeatable phenomena and people who could do the unthinkable. They found Uri Geller, a flamboyant Israeli performer known for bending spoons on stage. Geller arrived at SRI in late 1972 and was put through a battery of controlled tests. In one, a researcher locked a drawing inside a sealed envelope. Geller in another room was asked to reproduce it. Over and over, his sketches closely matched the hidden images. The CIA's reaction? Surprised, intrigued, and quietly they greenlit more funding. But Geller wasn't the only psychic in the room. Enter Ingo Swann, a New York artist with unusual claims. He could see places he'd never been. Swann helped develop what would become the core technique of America's psychic spy program, remote viewing, a method of mentally perceiving targets across distances and time, using nothing but concentration. As the program gained traction, it was handed off to the Defense Intelligence Agency and Army Intelligence and Security Command, under a series of evolving names: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, and finally Stargate. At Fort Meade, Maryland, a small team of soldiers and civilian contractors were trained in remote viewing. The process was surprisingly low-tech. A quiet room, a pen and paper, and an envelope containing coordinates or a photograph of the target. The viewer would enter a trance-like state, sketch impressions, describe sensations, and sometimes they got hits. But the Stargate project wasn't just about spying on bunkers. Viewers were asked to locate hostages, intercept nuclear weapons, to describe the insides of foreign embassies. Some were even asked to look into the future. In time, the work caught the attention and support of high-ranking officers. Chief among them was Major General Albert Stubblebine, head of Army Intelligence in the early 1980s. Stubblebine believed in psychic potential, publicly, passionately. He tried to walk through walls. He believed the human mind could be trained to influence electronics, decode enemy intentions, and even heal the body from within. To some he was a visionary, and to others he was an embarrassment. But his belief and his budget kept Stargate alive. By the late 1980s, the program was facing scrutiny. Results were inconsistent, some viewers excelled and others floundered. The work was difficult to replicate and the data often ambiguous. But insiders argued that something was happening, something they couldn't explain. In 1995, the CIA ordered a full evaluation. They declassified much of the Stargate files and hired independent scientists to assess whether psychic spying had ever produced actionable intelligence. The conclusion was mixed. Some reviewers were impressed, others weren't. The verdict? Let's just say it wasn't the X-Files. But it wasn't entirely fiction either. Next we'll examine the evidence. So let's talk results. For over 20 years, US intelligence poured resources into a question that science still can't fully answer. Can the mind perceive beyond the senses? Remote viewing became the centerpiece of the Stargate program. Dozens of operatives were trained, hundreds of sessions were logged. And buried within that archive were some startling hits. Let's begin with the Lovell, Wyoming incident. In 1989, remote viewer Angela Ford was assigned to locate a former customs agent who had gone rogue. With nothing but a photograph and a date, Ford entered a session and reported the target was in Lower Wyoming. There's just one issue. There is no Lower Wyoming. But there is a Lovell, Wyoming, just 100 miles from where the fugitive was arrested days later. Anomaly? Lucky guess? Meaningful miss? Intelligence officers were intrigued. Some were unsettled. Another case involved Joseph McMonigal, one of the program's most accomplished viewers. McMonigal claimed to have described the interior layout of a top-secret Soviet submarine facility from over 5,000 miles away. A later satellite reconnaissance confirmed details he had described, including a massive gantry crane and a specific layout of bay doors. The report was logged, a success. But what does success mean in a field where the rules are undefined? In 1995, as public scrutiny grew, the CIA commissioned an independent review from the American Institutes for Research. Two experts were brought in, Dr. Jessica Utz a statistician with a background in parapsychology, and Dr. Ray Hyman, a cognitive psychologist and longtime skeptic. Their task? Determine whether remote viewing produced any useful intelligence. Utz concluded that the results showed clear statistical significance, that something beyond chance seemed to be occurring. She wrote, "The evidence for psychic functioning is overwhelming. It would be wasteful to continue debating that point." The evidence for psychic functioning is overwhelming. It would be wasteful to continue debating that point. But Hyman disagreed. He noted the data lacked consistency, the protocols were often flawed, and most importantly, the information was too vague to act on. In other words, even if some of it was right, it wasn't usable. The final conclusion of the AIR report? Remote viewing has not been shown to have value in intelligence operations. And with that, the Stargate program was officially closed. But inside the archive are still hundreds of pages of remote viewing transcripts, some of which are uncanny. So what do we do with that? Some call it confirmation bias, others say it's a psychological trick, our tendency to impose patterns where none exist. Still others argue we're glimpsing something, but don't have the tools to understand it. The military call it anomalous cognition. Not quite seeing, not quite guessing. Something in between. And perhaps the most revealing part of this strange episode in US history is this: that the government believed just enough to keep it going. They couldn't prove it worked, but they also couldn't prove it didn't. And in the fog of war, uncertainty can be as powerful as truth. Because in the Cold War, sometimes the story mattered more than the facts. The Stargate files were full of data, measurements, protocols, transcripts. But outside the lab something else was happening. A current of belief, wilder, louder, harder to contain. Because if psychic spies were real, what else could be? As stories about government-funded remote viewers began to trickle out, first in whispers, then in news articles, then in books, the line between research and popular culture started to blur. And in that space, folklore took hold. In 1977, author Martin Eben published Psychic Warfare, Threat or Illusion, drawing on sources from both the US and Soviet programs. He described parapsychology as the next frontier of military conflict, and the public took notice. By the late 1980s, terms like mind control, psychic soldiers, and telepathic weapons were appearing in tabloids, and not just as fiction. It was becoming part of the language of conspiracy, and the media leaned in. Movies like Dead Zone and Scanners turned ESP into a weapon. Comics featured mutants with government-tested telepathy. TV shows hinted that military psychics were walking among us. Then came The Men Who Stare at Goats. First a book, then a film. A dark comedy based on real anecdotes from the Stargate program. The public laughed, but underneath the satire was something very real. And it wasn't just the US. Soviet propaganda occasionally leaked stories about their own psychics. Men who could read minds, predict disasters, or alter physical reality through thought. Whether real or fabricated, these stories created a fog that was impossible to fully penetrate. Some historians now believe both governments used psychic warfare as a tool of disinformation. Flood the narrative with just enough truth to keep it believable. Just enough fiction, though, to make it confusing. A weaponized mystery. But fear wasn't limited to intelligence circles. Within the US, some religious groups and skeptics began to frame psychic research in moral terms. ESP wasn't just unproven, it was dangerous. A gateway to manipulation or worse. Some claimed the CIA was tampering with spiritual forces. Others warned of New Age mysticism replacing rational thought. The idea of government-funded mind-reading was unsettling, and that discomfort spilled into the culture. Even now, elements of the Stargate program have become modern myth. Search YouTube, visit forums, you'll find thousands of people still training in remote viewing, still citing government documents, still convinced the veil was pierced and then pulled shut. The official line says it didn't work. The cultural response, maybe it worked too well. So what's left? After all the documents, the declassified memos, the tests, the public ridicule, what still lingers? Let's return to Ingo Swann, artist, psychic, architect of remote viewing. In the early 1970s, he was tasked with describing Jupiter. He sketched a banded gas giant with rings. Problem? At the time, scientists didn't believe Jupiter had rings. Years later, NASA's Pioneer 10 and Voyager missions confirmed it. Swann had been right. Coincidence? Educated guess? Or perception without proximity? Now back to the USSR. In 1970s Leningrad, Nina Kulagina was filmed influencing the movement of small objects. Matches, eggs, a compass needle. To believers, it's evidence of something extraordinary. To skeptics, it's sleight of hand, parlor tricks dressed up as science. But here's the catch. Even Soviet scientists couldn't fully agree. And the footage, while strange, isn't easily dismissed. In America, figures like Joseph McMoneagle and Angela Ford still teach remote viewing. Books, seminars, online courses, a cottage industry built on questions the government once asked. Some say they're sincere, others say they're cashing in. So what's the truth? Let's consider the documents. Dozens of sessions, viewers describing enemy facilities, claiming accurate data, some of it verified by satellite, some not. Even the 1995 AIR report left the door cracked open. Anomalous cognition exists, but it is not usable for intelligence purposes, it said. But what does that mean? It means something might be happening. We just don't know what. Maybe we never did. That ambiguity, that tension between evidence and interpretation, is the Psychic Cold War's most enduring legacy. It wasn't just about mind reading. It was about the lengths two world powers would go to because They feared that the other might know something they didn't, and if one side opened a door to the unexplained, the other couldn't risk leaving it shut. So here we are decades later. Some viewers believe they were part of something real. Some scientists say there's a signal beneath the noise. Others, though, say it's all noise. Our desperate need to see patterns where none exist. But in a world driven by belief and doubt, where intelligence meets imagination, where war meets wonder, one question still echoes. If it wasn't real, why did they act like it was? In the shadow games of the Cold War, belief itself became a battlefield. Both the United States and the Soviet Union spent real money, held real meetings, and commissioned real reports on something they could never quite prove and never fully abandon. Was it desperation? Fear? Or the quiet terror of knowing your enemy might see what you can't? Ingo Swann, Nina Kulagina, Joseph McMoneagle, Angela Ford. All names now tangled in the footnotes of history, yet each carrying a piece of a larger mystery. That somewhere between thought and space, between doubt and danger, someone thought we could see through time, sketch the invisible, tap into the unknown. Maybe they were right. Maybe they weren't. But that's not really the point. Because as we've seen time and again, you don't need to prove a thing works, only that someone believes it might. And that belief can move nations. It can fund programs. It can build entire myths. It can keep doors open that should have stayed shut. This has been Noir Frequency. If this transmission stirred something that made you think, question, or simply feel a little less alone in the dark, thank you for being here. You're the reason that we keep tuning the dial. For early access, bonus content, and an ad-free experience, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/noirfrequency. And if you want to carry the signal with you out into the world, our merch store has some nice t-shirts that I've designed. You can get to that at noirfrequency.com. Sharing the show, leaving a review, or even just talking about it with someone who needs a strange question in their day, that's how we grow. So thank you for listening, for thinking, and for wondering. Until next time, keep the frequency open. Thanks for being here.